The letter from the bank wouldn't lie flat on the counter. I kept smoothing it out, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling long enough to do the job properly. November 3rd, 2023, 2019 in the afternoon. Tomorrow morning, the locks on Clover Lane books would be changed by someone who wasn't me. 31 years old, and I was about to lose the only thing my grandmother ever left me that meant anything at all. I was wrapping her favorite reading chair in moving blankets when I heard the car pull up outside. You don't see many vehicles like that on Elm Street in Sudbury. A black Audi, clean and quiet, parking where the delivery bikes usually went. The woman who stepped out wore a grey wool coat that cost more than my monthly rent. The man behind her carried a slim briefcase and kept his eyes on the bookshop windows like he was reading the whole situation before walking into it. Her boots clicked against the old hardwood the moment she pushed the door open. The man said nothing, just stood there, watching me the way you watch someone you've been looking for a long time. The woman checked her phone, then looked directly at me. She said they represented someone I'd helped 17 years ago. Then she said, my Aunt Sylvia and her business partner were about to be arrested on fraud charges, federal ones, and they needed to secure my testimony before that happened. Then she asked if I remembered a little girl named Cora. My name is Audrey Callahan, and I need to tell you how one winter afternoon in 2006 unraveled my entire family and eventually saved my life. Let me go back to where it started. December 2006. I was 19, working part-time at my grandmother's bookshop while finishing my first year at Laurentian. Grandma Iris had run Clover Lane Books since 1987, a narrow little shop on Elm Street with creaky radiators, mismatched armchairs, and a cat named Biscuit who sat in the window and intimidated customers. My Aunt Sylvia, my mother's oldest sister, had moved back to Sudbury that autumn after her second divorce. She visited the shop constantly, always with that look on her face like she was measuring the walls for something else. Grandma was slowing down that winter. She complained about being tired in a way she never had before. A deep tired, she said, not the kind that sleep fixes. My aunt brought her new supplements from a naturopath she'd found online, capsules in amber bottles with handwritten labels. Grandma said they made her feel foggy instead of better. When I asked about it, my aunt smiled the way adults smile at children who just asked something embarrassing and said it was a transition period, that the body needed time to adjust. Grandma died on January 11, 2007. Cardiac event. Natural causes, said the doctor, for a woman of 74 with her history. My aunt was there holding her hand. I was driving back from campus when my phone rang. By the time I arrived, Sylvia had already spoken to the lawyer. The will, read 3 days later, surprised everyone who didn't already know the outcome. My aunt inherited the house, a Victorian on Large Street, worth close to $400,000. Even then, I inherited the bookshop. Not the building. Just the business, the inventory, Biscuit, and a commercial lease that Grandma had signed in 1993 with terms so stubborn they made the landlord at the time deeply unhappy. The lawyer read everything in the tone of someone announcing train departures. My aunt sat across the table in a charcoal blazer, and I noticed she kept glancing at her reflection in the window behind me. Already calculating. The strange part came after, at the reception. A man I didn't recognize introduced himself as Warren Croft, property developer. He had the particular manner of someone who practices seeming casual. He told me the shop was a lot of responsibility for someone my age, that the market was changing, that he could take the lease off my hands for $20,000 cash. He called it doing me a favor. He mentioned something about the lot's potential for mixed-use development in a way that didn't quite match the neighborhood we were standing in. I told him it wasn't for sale. He nodded, like I'd said something he'd expected to hear. December 22nd, 2006, 2 weeks before Grandma died, before I knew any of this was coming, was the night I found the girl. It had been the coldest week Sudbury had seen in 15 years. I was locking up alone, the last of the day's 2 customers long gone, when I heard something scraping near the back entrance by the alley. I thought it was the neighbor's dog. But dogs don't whimper quietly like they're trying not to be heard. She was wedged between the recycling bins and the back wall of the building. 7 years old, at most. She had a single-layer jacket, the kind you'd wear in October, and boots with no lining and a broken zipper held shut with a hair elastic. She was sitting on a flattened cardboard box and she had her arms wrapped around her knees, so tight it looked like she was trying to make herself smaller than she already was. When she saw me, she stood up fast like she was going to run. But she'd been out there too long. Her legs gave out after one step. I carried her inside. She weighed almost nothing. I set her on the reading chair closest to the radiator and got her tea with so much honey. The spoon stood up in it. It took her a while to talk. Her name was Cora, she said. She was 8. She'd run away from her foster placement in the flour mill neighborhood 4 days ago because the woman who ran the house took the children's winter coats away each evening and locked them in a closet, said they'd ruin them otherwise. One of the other kids had told Cora about the bookshop, that the lady there sometimes left hot chocolate by the back door on cold nights. That was Grandma, years before. The shop had been closed for 6 weeks while Grandma recovered from a fall. Cora hadn't known that. She'd been hoping anyway. I made her a proper meal from what I had in the back. Tin soup, crackers, a banana that was more brown than yellow, half a sleeve of digestive biscuits I'd been saving for slow afternoons. She ate everything. Then she looked at the shelves and asked in the most careful voice whether she was allowed to touch the books. I told her she could read any one she wanted. She picked a battered copy of Anne of Green Gables that had been on the $3 clearance shelf so long it had a permanent lean. She sat with it in her lap, and even though her hands were still shaking slightly from the cold, she turned each page with enormous care. I let her sleep that night in the back office on the gam cot I kept there for inventory weekends. I told myself it was just for the night. But when morning came and I found her already awake, reorganizing the children's section by color and size, with a focus that seemed almost compulsive, I knew I wasn't going to turn her out. She stayed 5 days. In those 5 days, I learned things about Cora that didn't fit together. She couldn't read quickly. She'd missed a lot of school. But she remembered everything she'd read perfectly, could recite passages word for word days later. She noticed patterns in things adults tuned out. She pointed out that the crime section sold faster in the first 2 weeks of the month, slower in the third and fourth. She'd only been watching the cash for 2 days. She was right. She also had a bruise along her collarbone that she said was from falling, and she flinched at sudden sounds in a way that had nothing to do with falling. On the 4th day, a social worker named Helen came by, not because of Cora, but for an unrelated check on a family next door. I brought her inside and told her what I'd found and what I'd noticed. Helen was a quiet woman who became very still when she was paying close attention. She was paying close attention. Cora was placed with a registered foster family in New Sudbury within 48 hours. The Michaus, a retired school principal and his wife who had 3 other kids in their home and a golden retriever and a chest freezer full of homemade soup. I should have felt relieved. This was better for Cora. It was everything she needed. A proper home, a safe placement, adults who were equipped to help her in ways that a 19-year-old running a failing bookshop alone had absolutely no business attempting. But watching her put on her coat to leave, holding that worn copy of Anne of Green Gables that I'd quietly moved from the clearance shelf to a paper bag so she could take it, was one of the hardest things I'd experienced to that point in my life. She stopped in the doorway and turned around. She said she was going to pay me back someday. For the soup and the book and the flinching I'd pretended not to notice. I told her she didn't owe me anything. She looked at me with the steady eyes of someone who was already decided. I keep my promises, she said. Helen sent me updates over the following month. Cora was settling in. She was slow to trust, but consistent once she did. She was catching up in school at a speed that surprised her teachers. The Michaus were hoping to adopt. 2 weeks after Cora left, I found something while clearing out Grandma's desk in the back office. A journal, tucked behind a false bottom in the bottom drawer. Grandma had been thorough about privacy her whole life. I hadn't known the force bottom existed. The entries from the previous string were ordinary. Book orders, customer notes, complaints about the ice on the front step. But the entries from September were different. Sylvia brought new supplements. The green ones from before have been swapped for white ones. I feel slower every day. Tried to tell Audrey on the phone, but Sylvia was here and I didn't want to cause a fuss. Not confused, worried. I sat on the floor of the back office for a long time after reading that. White capsules, green capsules. Green capsules, grandma's heart medication was green capped. What were the white ones? I had no proof, no way to push further without sounding like a 20-year-old who'd watched too many crime dramas. So I put the journal in a fireproof lockbox I bought the next day, and I waited. My Aunt Sylvia and Warren Croft began what I can only describe as a campaign of removal. First, it was the health inspector, someone Sylvia had been friendly with since high school, who found violations that weren't there. Dust patterns dated to specific weeks I had documented photos of. Temperature readings on a refrigeration unit I'd had serviced 10 days prior. I fought each one, won most of them eventually. But the legal fees were money I didn't have, and time I couldn't recover. Sylvia visited regularly. Always early, always wearing that particular expression that was somehow both concerned and satisfied. She'd ask about the shop's numbers in the tone of someone already knowing the answer, and she'd mention, each time in a slightly different way, that Warren's offer was still open, that he was a reasonable man, that the building was going to be sold regardless, and I should get ahead of it while I still could. Warren Croft. That name kept showing up the way bad weather does, announced before it arrived and somehow still surprising. He'd married well. A seat on the Sudbury Economic Development Council, connections at City Hall that explained a lot of things, permit delays that stretched 6-week repairs into 4-month ones, a business license review in 2011 that had no discernible trigger, an anonymous complaint to the fire marshal in 2013 about an exit I'd had inspected and certified 8 months prior. My regular customers noticed there was Vida, 73, and sharp as broken glass, who started what she called her observation practice, sitting with her coffee at the window table on mornings after Sylvia's visits and writing down plates and times in a little spiral notebook. There was Dominic from the hardware shop across the street, who started coming in twice a day instead of once and quietly passed along anything he heard. There was the book club that met every other Tuesday and had, at some point, collectively decided that Clover Lane was worth protecting. I started my own documentation. Every visit, every violation, every letter. Photos. Notes with timestamps. I kept a recorder in my jacket pocket during any conversation with Sylvia or anyone connected to Warren. Ontario is single-party consent. I looked that up in 2009 and never forgot it. Then, in 2013, the money orders started. The first one arrived in June, $340. No name, no return address, just a Canada Post money order and a piece of plain paper with 4 words typed on it, from someone who remembers. I stood in the back office and cried until Biscuit came over and sat on my feet, which was his version of comfort. They came every month after that. Never exactly the same amount, but always close to what I was short by. When the front windows needed emergency weatherproofing in November 2015, that month's envelope was enough for a professional job and the leftover 100 for stock. When the boiler made a sound in February 2016 that turned out to be an $80 fix but could have been a $1,000 problem, the money arrived 3 days before the plumber's bill. It felt, each time, like someone was watching, calculating, caring. I never figured out who. I tried for about 6 months, then stopped. There was something about not knowing that felt almost sacred. Someone out there believing I was worth keeping afloat, asking nothing in return. By 2016, my aunt had escalated. She spread stories at the neighborhood association that I was struggling with my mental health, that the shop was a symptom of instability rather than a livelihood. She had acquaintances of hers request wellness checks, hoping, I think, that something would come of them that would let her question my competency legally. When nothing came of that, she and Warren engineered an HST audit through a contact at the CRA. The audit found nothing because there was nothing to find. The auditor told me privately at the door as he left that the referral had seemed unusual to him. I started joking with the regulars that I needed a bingo card. Anonymous complaint to the city. Check. Sylvia visits before 8 in the morning. Check. Warren's assistant dropping by to check the neighborhood. Check. Dara won the bingo once, legitimately, and took a free book. In 2018, Warren found his lever. Buried in page 39 of the original lease was a clause that allowed for rent adjustment following significant structural improvements to the building. Warren had purchased the property from the previous owner to a numbered company in 2014. I hadn't found that out until I hired a property lawyer that year. What I found out in 2018 was that Warren had added a secondary drainage line to the building's east wall. A contractor I spoke to afterward told me it was 4 hours of work and materials that cost less than $200. Warren called it a significant structural improvement. My rent went from $1,400 a month to $5,800. I appealed, lost, appealed again. The adjudicator had done contract work for one of Warren's numbered companies 3 years prior. I found that out too late. The notice came on October 1, 2023. 3 months of back rent at the new rate, totaling just over $20,000, or vacate by November 4th. The bookshop that had survived 3 recessions, 2 ownership transitions, and 17 years of deliberate sabotage was going to close because of a drainage pipe that cost less than my weekly grocery run. I started packing quietly, not dramatically, just in the way of someone accepting something they'd been fighting against for long enough that the fighting had become the shape of their life. I gave extra stock to the library's used book sale, wrote letters for my 2 part-time staff, told the Tuesday book club they might want to think about moving to the library meeting room after December. Vera cried. I told her not to, and then we both did. I kept stress baking, which I do when I'm anxious, and stress baking in earnest when I'm terrified. By October 20th, I'd made 11 dozen butter tarts and given most of them to the Montessori school 2 doors down, because the alternative was eating 11 dozen butter tarts alone in a shop I was losing. Sylvia visited on November 2nd. She sat at the counter, ordered a chamomile tea, and spent 45 minutes telling me everything. How they'd worked for years to wear me down. How Grandma's death hadn't been natural. That the white capsules were a blood pressure medication that Sylvia had researched carefully, knowing what would happen when it interacted with Grandma's existing heart prescription. How Warren's surveyor had found something extraordinary beneath this block of Elm Street in 2005. A rare earth mineral deposit, the kind that battery manufacturers were starting to pay enormous prices for. How my grandmother's lease, with its subsurface rights clause, had stood between Warren and everything he planned for nearly 2 decades. How stupid I'd been, she said, sipping her tea, sitting on something worth more than I could count while clipping coupons and trying over book donations. She left a $50 bill on the counter. At least you have gas money, she said. That night, I sat in the dark shop among my packed boxes, holding Grandma's journal, and I thought about Cora, who I hadn't seen since she was 8 years old. I thought about how she promised to pay me back someday and how I told her not to worry about it. I thought about how the anonymous money orders had kept me going for 10 years and I'd never figured out where they came from. I thought about how I had failed Grandma, failed the shop, failed to hold on to the thing that was supposed to be mine. November 3rd arrived like the last page of a book you'd been hoping would end differently. I was alone, folding Grandma's reading quilt into a box, when the Audi pulled up. The woman introduced herself as Rachel Dow, a lawyer specializing in RICO prosecutions. The RCMP had been building a case for 18 months. The man beside her hadn't spoken yet. He was watching me with a stillness that felt familiar, like a habit rather than a personality. Mrs. Borsey, Callahan, Rachel said. Before we proceed, there's something Dr. Cora Park wanted to ask you personally. The man stepped back, and the woman I hadn't seen since she was 8 years old walked through my front door. She was 25 now, with her mother's serious eyes and a posture that said she'd learned, somewhere along the way, how to take up her own space. She was wearing the University of Toronto lanyard and carrying a coffee cup from the Tim Hortons 2 blocks away. Because she'd arrived early and spent an hour walking the street before she was ready to come in. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, I still had the book. My knees gave out. I grabbed the nearest shelf. She crossed the room in 3 steps and caught my arm. Cora, I said. You have glasses now, she laughed. You gave me $340 a month for 10 years, she said. That's $40,800. With compound interest at current Bank of Canada prime rate, I owe you considerably more. She was smiling, but her voice was shaking slightly. I've had that calculated since I was 14. Rachel Tao moved to the center of the room. We have your aunt's full confession, she said. She made a significant tactical error at a dinner with what she believed was a prospective investor last month. The woman was an undercover RCMP officer. Cora pulled out a tablet and turned it toward me. The recording was clear. My aunt's voice, wine loosened, describing the capsule switch with the detachment of someone recounting a grocery list. How she'd researched the interaction carefully. How Grandma had been confused in those last weeks, which made it easier. How Warren had needed the house as collateral and the lease terminated to access the deposit beneath, and how Grandma had simply been in the way. I went to the bathroom. I didn't get there in time. When I came back, Cora was on the phone. All teams confirmed, she said. Both simultaneous. Yes, I'll hold. She hung up and turned to me. Warren is being arrested at the travelway on the bypass. He's at a development conference. My aunt is at her Saturday Pilates class in the new Sudbury Center. I actually laughed at that. It came out strange and wet, but it was real. Cora sat down across from me at the counter, where I'd made her soup 17 years ago. After the meatballs, she said, I never stopped thinking about this place. About you. I aged out of the foster system at 18. Got into U of T on a partial scholarship, computer science. I wrote a thesis on pattern recognition in financial fraud networks. I'd been building the underlying model since I was 16, tracking public records on property transfers in Northern Ontario. Warren's company signatures kept appearing in a specific sequence every time a property with unusual subsurface characteristics changed hands. She paused. He wasn't just doing this to you. We've identified 19 properties across Ontario. Small businesses, family homes, a church, a community center, all acquired below market value after systematic pressure campaigns, all sitting on mineral or development assets that weren't disclosed to the original owners. Rachel added, that triggered federal jurisdiction. What started as a civil fraud case became an organized crime investigation. Dr. Michard Park's analysis was the architecture of the entire prosecution. My phone started buzzing. Local news notifications. Prominent Sudbury developer taken into custody. Woman arrested in connection with long-running fraud scheme. RCMP announces major Northern Ontario prosecution. Cora showed me one more video. Warren, in a conference lanyard, attempting to walk briskly past RCMP officers in a hotel corridor and catching his heel on a carpet seam. He went down hard and pulled a display of local tourism brochures with him. A bystander actually applauded. The murder charge, I said. Will it stick? Rachel nodded. The confession is authenticated, combined with the pharmacy records. Your aunt purchased both medications within a 3-week window under her own name, apparently confident she'd never need to answer for it. And the journal you kept, and recordings we obtained of Warren explicitly discussing the need for your grandmother to be, as he put it, out of the equation. Yes, it will stick. Cora reached into her bag and pulled out a document folder. The eviction is stayed, she said. A federal judge signed the injunction at 9 this morning. The rent increase is void pending the fraud investigation. And Audrey. She paused, and for just a moment, she looked like the 8-year-old sitting in the armchair with the worn paperback. You need to understand what's under this building. Rachel explained it. The 2005 geological survey that Warren had obtained and buried. a significant lithium and cobalt deposit extending beneath the entire block. Clean energy applications. Conservative current market estimate $22 million. My grandmother's lease had included a subsurface rights clause that her original lawyer had suggested as a standard protection. She'd agreed without fully understanding what she was agreeing to. She'd been right anyway. Every year, every fake violation, every legal fee, every sleepless February counting down whether I had enough to make it to March. It had all been about what was sitting 40 feet below the floor where I was standing in my grandmother's reading socks. My regulars started appearing within an hour, drawn by the news. Vera came in carrying a bottle of Riesling and a look on her face like she'd been waiting 17 years for exactly this. Dominic left a sign in the hardware shop window that said, "Closed, celebrating justice, Bark Monday." The Tuesday book club arrived collectively, as if they'd been convened by some signal I hadn't sent. Cora stayed in the corner, drinking her Tim Hortons coffee, watching, not seeking attention, just present. I pulled her aside near the back. "Why?" I asked. "You built a career around this. You could have handed it to the RCMP years ago and moved on." She looked at the shelves for a moment. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to a photo, and turned it toward me. A battered copy of Anne of Green Gables. Spine repaired with clear tape, cover worn to a soft grey at the corners. "You showed me," she said, "that somebody could look at a person everyone else had given up on and just decide they were worth something without needing anything back. I spent 4 years of my PhD building the algorithm that caught Warren, and every time I got stuck, I thought about that, about how you had $47 in the till and you made soup anyway." She had more to say, I could tell, but she was someone who'd learned to be careful with words, so she let that be enough. Rachel Tao updated us that evening. The investigation had expanded to 19 properties, 6 arrests beyond my aunt and Warren, including a city councillor and 2 building inspectors who'd been on Warren's payroll for over a decade. The Crown was calling it the largest municipal fraud prosecution in northeastern Ontario's history. The restitution figures were staggering. Assets seized, Warren's properties, his investment portfolio, my aunt's house on Large Street, the house Grandma had been killed for, her car, her savings, the jewelry she'd bought herself the year after the funeral, all of it. My aunt received life in prison with no possibility of parole for 20 years. Warren received 25 years federal with eligibility for parole after 12. The city councillor received 8 years. The inspectors each received 4 to 6. Vera told me afterward cheerfully that my aunt had been assigned to laundry duty at Grand Valley Institution and reportedly found the industrial folding machines deeply unreasonable. Warren died in 2031, 7 years into his sentence, still reportedly convinced there was a legal angle he hadn't tried. The mineral rights resolved the way these things do when someone finally stops hiding them. A clean energy consortium offered $18 million for the extraction rights. I kept $1 million, enough to renovate the building properly for the first time in 30 years, and live without counting the weeks between money orders. The rest established the Iris Callahan Foundation, named for Grandma, providing legal support to small business owners and elderly residents facing predatory property pressure across northern Ontario. Cora and I designed the foundation together. She moved back to Sudbury in 2024 to run it. Her fraud detection model, the one she'd built to catch Warren, became open-source software used by 11 provincial legal aid offices and eventually by the federal government. In 4 years, it had flagged over 160 similar schemes across the country. I reopened the shop on Canada Day 2024. It felt like the right kind of symbolic, even if it's a little on the nose. I kept Grandma's layout, the mismatched armchairs, the clearance shelf by the door. I added one item to the small free leads basket near the counter, a hardcover edition of Anne of Green Gables. No conditions for anyone who needed it. The item in the basket has been replaced 43 times in the past year. Vera declared herself the official tracker of this statistic and has a spreadsheet. The night before the reopening, Cora and I sat in the closed shop, boxes finally unpacked, Shelves full again. She had a mug of tea. I had the honey jar because my hands still needed something to do. She said, I calculated it, you know. Every dollar you spent on me that week, the soup, the food, the camcot linen, I bled on when my feet were cracked from the cold, plus the book. In $2006, I told her she really didn't have to. She ignored me and kept going. Then I calculated what you spent on me in another way. She looked up. The energy you spent on a kid who wasn't yours and wasn't your problem and had nothing to offer you. I've been trying to figure out a dollar value for that my whole adult life, and I genuinely cannot. I told her that was the point. She smiled. I know, she said. That's why I'm here. December 22nd, 2024. Exactly 18 years after I found her behind the recycling bins. The shop was warm and full of the last of the evening customers. When I went to lock the back door, I told myself I wasn't thinking about it. I was very obviously thinking about it. There was no one there. I stood in the alley for a moment anyway, just breathing the cold Sudbury air, looking at the spot between the bins and the wall. Went back inside. Turned the sign. Poured myself tea. That was enough. That was exactly enough. I think about Vera sometimes, sitting at that window table with her little spiral notebook, writing down license plates at 7 in the morning. Because she'd decided on her own that what was happening to me wasn't right and she was going to do something about it. She wasn't asked. She didn't wait for someone with more authority to act first. She just picked up a pen and started paying attention. That, to me, is what it looks like when a person's character shows up in ordinary life. Not in grand gestures, but in small, persistent acts that nobody is watching for. I didn't shelter Cora because I expected anything back. I want to be honest about that. I was 19 years old, I had $47 in the till, and I was probably not thinking clearly about consequences at all. I just couldn't leave her there. What I've come to understand, years later, is that the choices we make when we have nothing to gain from them are the ones that actually define us. Not the resume entries, not the moments with an audience. The ones at the back door at closing time, in the cold, when the easiest thing would be to pretend we didn't hear anything. Cora grew up to become someone who used her mind like a precision instrument, who looked at property records and financial transfers the way other people look at weather patterns, until she could see the shape of what Warren had been doing across 2 decades and 19 properties. She wasn't born knowing how to do that. She built it. She sat with the material until she understood it, and then she built something that could catch what she'd found. That kind of thinking doesn't happen by accident. It's a choice to keep going past the point where it's comfortable, past the point where the answer is clear, past the point where someone else might have handed the problem off. I watched her explain the algorithm to a room full of RCMP analysts once, and what struck me wasn't how smart she was, though she is. It was how much of herself she put into it. That's a different thing entirely. What I had to learn, the hard way and over many years, is that staying isn't the same as stubbornness. Sylvia and Warren bet from the beginning that I would eventually stop, that the legal fees and the fake violations and the early morning visits would compound until the weight of it was more than the shop was worth. They were calculating correctly, by every reasonable measure. What they miscounted was the difference between someone who stays because they have nowhere else to go and someone who stays because they've decided the thing is worth staying for. I'm not sure I fully understood that difference myself until very late. My grandmother knew something was wrong with those white capsules and she wrote it down anyway in a journal she hid in a drawer with a false bottom, because some part of her understood that the truth has weight even when no one is looking for it yet. That's the thing about keeping records. Keeping your word, keeping your nerve, it all operates on a kind of delayed return. You don't always see what it's building. You just have to trust that integrity compounds the same way everything else does, slowly and then all at once. The girl who promised to pay me back from the doorway of my shop in 2006 kept that promise in every way a person can. Not just the money orders, not just the algorithm. She paid it back by becoming someone who doesn't look away. That's the whole thing, really. That's what I hope people take from the story. Not the mineral rights or the sentencing, but the simple fact that one person who refuses to look away can change the shape of what's possible for everyone around them. Clover Lane is still open. The Anne of Green Gables basket is down to its last copy again. I'll replace it tomorrow.